Hello children, good morning. How are you all? Today let us do the questions and answers of the address. Extra questions, okay? First we'll do the short answer type. First one, describe the first visit of Mrs. Totter to the house of Mrs. Darling. Mrs. Daughter found Mrs. Darling Mrs. S.'s daughter found Mrs. Darling's house and rang the bell. Mrs. Darling opened the door but was not happy to see the visitor. She rudely said that what? People who had left did not return. She did not allow the visitor to come in. She closed the door that she could not do anything for her. So she closed the door. Why do you think Mrs. Darling knowingly refused to recognize the narrator when she went to meet after years? Mrs. Darling had removed many valuables and antiques from the narrator's family on the pretext of taking care of them. Now that the narrator, the daughter of Mrs. S., had come to claim them, Mrs. Darling did not wish to return them. Therefore, she refused to recognize her. See how mean of her. How did the narrator realize that she had come to the right address? The narrator knew that she had come to the right address because the woman who opened the door was wearing her mother's green cardigan. Who was Mrs. Darling? Why did she visit Mrs. S.'s house frequently? Mrs. Darling was merely an acquaintance of Mrs. S. Mrs. S. belonged to a wealthy Jewish family, and all her possessions were beautiful and very costly. The Second World War broke out and the Jews were persecuted everywhere. The Germans were in control. Jews had to leave their homes and possessions behind to save their lives. In this background, Mrs. Darling revived her acquaintance with Mrs. S. and carried away suitcases and sack full of precious things. So she was very greedy. Yes. Why did Mrs. S. ask her daughter to remember the address of Mrs. Darling? Mrs. Darling had taken the valuable possessions of Mrs. S. for safekeeping. She wanted to keep them safely, but that was not her intention. Mrs. S. wanted her daughter to remember the address so that she could claim their belongings someday after the war. How did the narrator in the address come to know that the cutlery was silver? In her conversation with Mrs. Darling's daughter, the narrator realized that Mrs. Darling had stolen her family's valuable possessions. She remembered that her mother had asked her to polish the silver cutlery. What were the narrator's feelings initially about the things that had been left with Mrs. Tolling. The narrator was not at all interested in claiming the things that were stored with Mrs. Tolling, as the things were lifeless possessions. They were not important as dear and loved ones whom she had lost during the war. Her mother did not survive after the war. Moreover, she was afraid they would remind her of her past. Why does the narrator say, "I was in a room I knew and did not know"? All around in Mrs. Tolling's home, the narrator saw the precious possessions of her family. They were displayed in an ugly setting, though the things were known to her. Their environment was tasteless and crude. How was Mrs. Tolling taking care of the antiques and other things she had taken from Mrs. S? Mrs. Tolling did not take good care of the antiques and other things she had taken from Mrs. S. Things were arranged in tasteless manner. She did not even know that the spoons, knives, and forks she was using every day were made of silver. Why did the narrator, when the narrator went the second time to 46 Marconi Street, she noticed the Hanukkah which belonged to her family, the antiques of familiar woolen tablecloth, a painting, teapot, silver cutlery of her family. They were arranged in tasteless manner and handled carelessly. She was filled with disgust and certainly did not want those beautiful things. She did not want to meet Mrs. Tolling and left the house. Why did the narrator want to forget the address? The narrator wanted to forget the address because she did not want to take back her family's precious possessions, the antiques, silver paintings, etc. from Mrs. Tolling. Initially, she had gone to 46 Marconi Street to take back her belongings, but when she saw them in a different setting, used carelessly, she no longer felt attachment and desire to have them back. She felt it was of no use. Moreover, her mother was also not there. She felt it would be easy to forget that address. Could Mrs. S.'s daughter get back to her old life after she came back to the city where she lived before the war? No, she could not. Before the war, Mrs. S. and her daughter lived in a life of comfort and luxury. The house was full of beautiful things and expensive antiques. Their everyday cutlery was made of silver. After the war, Mrs. S.'s daughter came back to the town alone. The family was probably dead. She lived in a small room. The bread that she ate was dark and tasteless. She had seen fear and insecurity. She did not even have place to keep her mother's possessions, which they left under Mrs. Tolling's custody. Her lifestyle did not at all resemble her earlier luxurious living. Okay, long answer time. Why did the narrator, Mrs. S.'s daughter, specially make a trip to 46 Marconi Street? Did she achieve her purpose? The narrator, Mrs. S.'s daughter, specially made a trip to 46 Marconi Street to get back her mother's priceless belongings, which Mrs. Tolling had taken from her mother with the understanding that she would return them after the war. No, she did not achieve her purpose, as she could not get them back. The narrator met with an extremely cold and unfriendly behavior at 46 Marconi Street. Mrs. Darling did not like that she had come back for them. She refused to recognize her first. She did not allow the narrator to enter. She pretended to be busy, closed the door on her face. What a bad behavior. How did Mrs. Darling receive Mrs. S.'s daughter when she came back after several years? How do you explain her behavior? Mrs. Darling was cold and unfriendly. When Mrs. S.'s daughter came back after several years, she understood she had to claim the beautiful possessions, the antiques, the silver cutlery and all that. Mrs. Darling had no intention of returning those things to her. Therefore, she was cold and rude. She did not even let her in. She told her she could not do anything for her. It was not convenient for her to meet the narrator, and she should come some other time. She closed the door. She was still at the doorstep. Describe the second visit of Mrs. S.'s daughter to the house of Darling. Why did she not wait for Mrs. Darling? What was the reason? Why did she not wait? Okay, when the narrator went for the second time to 46 Marconi Street, it was Darling's daughter who opened the door and let the narrator come into the house. Immediately she recognized her mother's priceless possessions. She noticed the Hanukkah, which belonged to her family. The walls had the antiques. Her familiar woolen tablecloth was on the table, and she recognized the painting, the teapot, and the silver cutlery of her family. Seeing these things, however, they did not give her any pleasure because they were arranged in a tasteless manner. She decided never to come back to that address. How did Mrs. Darling acquire the possessions of Mrs. S? What extraordinary circumstances made it possible to justify Mrs. Darling's conduct? Mrs. Darling was merely an acquaintance of Mrs. S, and Mrs. S belonged to a wealthy Jewish family, and all her possessions were beautiful and of great value. That means very costly. The Second World War broke out and the Jews were persecuted everywhere. The Germans were in control. The Jews had to leave their homes and possessions behind to save their lives. In this background, Mrs. Darling revived her acquaintance with Mrs. S and carried away suitcases and sackful of precious things, saying she wanted to save all the nice things. But afterwards, what did she do? She was in no mood to return the costly items. She was greedy. She acted out of greed and meanness. She did not even admit Mrs. S.'s daughter into her house and was exceedingly rude. Why did the narrator say that forgetting Mrs. Darling's address would be the easiest of all things? So what type of a lady was she? She was a very greedy lady. Mrs. Darling did not take good care of her mother's possessions. Things were arranged in a very tasteless manner. Things were not handled properly, and that disappointed the narrator. She immediately decided to forget everything connected with the past. She wanted to continue living a new life. She resolved to forget that address as she felt that of all the things she had to forget, forgetting the address would be the easiest. Moreover, it was of no use to remember the address. She had received such a bad behavior there. Compare the lifestyle of Mrs. S. before the war with her daughter after the war. Before the war, Mrs. S. and her daughter lived a life of comfort and luxury. Why? How can you say that? They used all the costly things. The house was full of beautiful things, expensive antiques. Mrs. S.'s daughter came back to the town alone. The family was probably dead. She lived in a small room. The bread that she ate was dark and tasteless. She had seen fear and insecurity. She did not even have place to keep cutlery. Her lifestyle did not at all resemble her luxurious living. Now, this is a very important question. Very often you get it in the exam. Justify the title of the story, the address. The address is a title that indirectly brings out the pain that war inflicted on the narrator. Again, very important question. If you read the lesson properly, you will be able to write the answer. The address was 46 Marconi Street, where a woman named Mrs. Darling lived with her family. The address was important to the narrator because her mother had given the family valuables to Mrs. Darling for safekeeping. But Mrs. Darling's intention was something different. When after the war, the narrator went back to the address, she found her family's precious possessions in an ugly setting, all tastelessly displayed. The value was not appreciated and they were used very carelessly. That means they did not take care of those possessions. She was so repelled that she decided to leave the things and forget the address and never to remember it again. The address became too painful to remember. It becomes a symbolic of the shabbiness and the pettiness of Mrs. Darling. She was very keen about getting things back, but ironically resolved to forget about them and begin a new life, leaving the past behind. Because she knew it was no use to remember that. Moreover, her mother was also not there. So, once again, we'll have a look at this answer. Justify the title of the story, the address. Very important. The address is a title that indirectly brings out the pain that war inflicted on the narrator. The address was 46 Marconi Street, where a woman named Mrs. Darling lived with her family. The address was important to the narrator because her mother had given the family valuables to Mrs. Darling for safekeeping, but her intentions were bad, not to return the things. Their value was not appreciated at all. She was so repelled that she decided to leave the things and forget the address. The address became painful to remember. It becomes symbolic of the shabbiness and the pettiness of Mrs. Darling. She was very keen about getting things back, but ironically, finally she decided never to remember that address. Okay, once again, let's go through these questions. Why did the narrator, Mrs. S.'s daughter, specially make a trip to 46 Marconi Street? Did she achieve her purpose? The narrator, Mrs. S.'s daughter, specially made a trip to 46 Marconi Street to get back her mother's priceless belongings, which Mrs. Darling had taken from her mother with the understanding that she would return them after the war. But her intentions changed afterwards. She was in no mood to return the belongings. She even refused to recognize her. She did not allow her to enter her house. Then she pretended to be busy and closed the door on her face. Okay, children, now what are you supposed to do? We have done so many question, answers, summary and all that. Please go through the all the questions and answers. First you read the lesson, okay, with proper understanding. Write down the difficult words and meanings. Write down all the questions and answers. Every question is important. If you read the lesson 3 times, you will be able to answer any and every question. Okay. So go through the questions and answers. Don't waste time. Now, if you happen to come across a difficult word, the meaning of which you do not know, what are you supposed to do? Look up, okay? Because very often in the 1 mark question, I ask such questions. What is the meaning of a particular word? Sometimes I tell you to make sentence with the word just to check whether you have understood the meaning or not. Otherwise also you are supposed to know the meanings of all the difficult words. So this is a very important lesson from the point of view of examination, very favorite with the examiners. Read it again and again. Otherwise also it's a very beautiful and touching story. So read it 2-3 times. You don't have to worry for the examination. Everything will be very clear to you. I hope you are going to follow my instructions. Thank you. Have a nice day.